Hello, bookworms. Welcome to The Best Book Ever, the podcast where we talk about your favorite books. I'm your host, Julie Strauss, and today I'm so pleased to talk to Robyn Shipton. Robyn was raised in Colorado and spent several years in Flagstaff, Arizona, where she received her bachelor's in visual anthropology, a master's in communications and documentary studies, and then spent a year serving the arts community as an AmeriCorps member with the Flagstaff Arts Council. She has spent the last 5.5 years working in video production in Colorado before diving into podcasting last year when she launched the Dreams Talk podcast and the Playlist Challenge podcast. I had a great time talking to Robyn about her creative ventures and about why she thinks Biting the Sun by Tanith Lee is the best book ever. The Indie Bookstore Spotlight of the Week is Robyn's favorite and also happens to be one of my all-time favorites in the United States, the Tattered Cover Bookstore. I've been to their historic Denver location a few times, and I cannot wait to go back. Like all great indie bookstores, the Tattered Cover ships, and they're currently holding virtual author events. It's an absolutely beautiful bookstore, one that you get so comfortable in that you look up from your browsing and realize that you've been there all day. For a really fun treat, go to their website, thetatteredcover.com, and check out their Love Letters to Authors section. I spent a solid hour reading through them, and it will not surprise you to know that I got very weepy about the power that books have over readers. As always, this is not a paid ad or sponsorship. All of the book links in my show notes support independent bookstores. Please consider doing your holiday shopping at a store run by real book people, not one run by algorithms. Now, back to the show. Hi, Robyn. Welcome to the Best Book Ever podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It is my pleasure. Robyn, the first thing I want to ask you is, I think you have two of the most unique podcast concepts I've ever heard of. And I was hoping you could start off by telling our listeners about your two different projects, because I think they're so fascinating.
Thanks. Yeah, I didn't really get into podcasting until last year. There's a local podcast incubator here in Denver called House of Pod, and they're wonderful. They have a really awesome workspace and studio that's pretty accessible for people in Denver. And I actually did a master's in communication and documentary studies. And so my thesis project was an audio documentary exploring how people are using sound healing, like sound and vibrations, to cope with anxiety and depression. And so that just really got me going as far as like all kinds of ideas of different podcasts and different audio things you could do. And so I was just like constantly generating a list. And I'm the type of person where I like to incorporate all kinds of different ideas together into a project because I feel like they're the most fun to just try and organize all of that together. And so I definitely wanted to do something about dreams, because dreaming has always been really interesting and fascinating and important for me in my understanding of myself and of life and the experiences that I go through. And I also love storytelling. I love hearing people tell stories. And so, and then also just my background in communication and anthropology is very much focused on identity and how communication shapes our identity. And just for me, dreams are a conversation with ourselves, and they very much reflect who we are and how we see ourselves in the world. So that was the idea for the Dreams Talk podcast. And it's funny, I had definitely taken a different approach when I started it. I thought I was going to have like all these experts talking about dreams on there. And then I realized that I really just wanted to have a conversation that was casual with people I knew who had interesting dreams, and could involve that storytelling element with them starting out telling it almost like in a storytelling voice, one of their dreams that they had. And then we'd go in and talk about it. And I could do my own sort of processing and reflection of that.
Do you invite people to tell about those dreams where you just have the wacky dream, like, last night I dreamt that you had 4 legs and you were the checker at my Trader Joe's? Or do you ask for like the stories, the people who, I've had a dream that I could fly at my grammar school since I was a child. I've had that recurring dream.
I try to have people think of a dream that is really profound to them, whether they've had it a bunch, whether they only had it once, something that was really vivid and memorable to them that they could then write out to read on the podcast that incorporated as many details as they could put into it so that you really bring the listener into it. And then that kind of shapes the theme of the podcast of like what we talk about mainly for that story. So for the 3rd episode, Evan talked about this dream that ended up kind of having a lot of themes in a lot of other dreams that he would have of like sort of shadowy figures or these like mangled creatures on platters. And it ended up being this sort of analogy for him being closeted as a gay man and what that process was like for him to come to terms with that years later and then finally being able to come out and not having those dreams as much anymore. And so that episode was a lot about coming out and processing aspects of your identity that you have a hard time accepting or that are, sheltered away from yourself and kind of exiled.
I love that phrase that you said, that they're a conversation with yourself. I've never heard that before. I love that because it's always felt like that to me, they're just sort of a salad bowl with people I've ever come across and just sort of shaken up, and I have to figure out what was going on.
Yeah, I think there's a range. I mean, I can definitely tell when I've had dreams that are very much inspired by events or people in my life at the time, whether I'm working through something challenging or there's an insecurity I have or something I'm concerned about, or something I read or watched recently. And then other times I feel like my spirit gets sent on this journey and I can travel interdimensionally, and like, that's what I think those are the ones that always I feel I have the most fun with because they're not based in this reality. And we'll talk about this in a bit, but like, it's very much how I relate to Biting the Sun as far as her dream experiences. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why I connected to that book.
And it's funny you say that because the whole time I was reading it, I kept thinking the words fever dream kept going through. This is one big fever dream of a book.
Yeah.
Well, so before we talk about that, your other project is much more reality based. Your music podcast. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So the playlist challenge started a couple of years ago, actually, not as a podcast or anything. It was just a way to have fun at work. My boss and I were constantly sending music back and forth. And so I had an experience several years prior to where my boss at that other job had everybody on the team put together playlists and then we would share them at a party at the end of the summer. And I love that idea, but I'm also a little bit competitive. And so I wanted to have fun with it, incorporate everybody. And so we turned it into a challenge where everybody had to make a playlist. We'd all get a certain amount of time to listen and then we'd vote on whichever playlist we liked the most. And so we just started recruiting and we got 8 people to play in the first challenge. And it's kind of tournament style where we pick a theme and then the players have to create an 8-song playlist to fit that theme. We launch them on the website and then people who wherever they can all come to the website, listen to the playlists and vote. But we also have the podcast portion, which is sort of a mini episode. We try to make it no longer than like a standard song would be. And that allows our challengers to kind of defend their music selections and say like, here's what I meant with this, here's what this music means. And this is why I curated it this way. And then, we do an intro episode and an outro episode that kind of like bookend the challenge and kind of like get listeners ready for what to expect. And then the conclusion wrap up episode, we get to hear from the 2 finalists. We talk about how the challenge actually went. And then we get to have the winner of the challenge explain what the next challenge theme is going to be. That's part of the prize of winning, is getting to choose the next theme. Yeah.
So can you give me an example of a theme that you've had?
The 3 that we've done so far with the public challenge is the first one was the best summer soundtrack. And then we had the travel playlists, those globe trotting. So it's kind of your best travel soundtrack. And then this last one that we wrapped up was the Weird Covers Challenge. And so you had to pick 5 cover songs that, you know, were weird or bizarre, unknown.
Well, so I know from your bio and just from these few minutes of talking to you, you seem to have a very visually and musically influenced life and a very artistically influenced life. What's your reading life like?
Yeah, I primarily read sci-fi and fantasy. Probably not a surprise there, but um, I grew up with 2 sci-fi nerd parents. You know, we watched all kinds of sci-fi stuff growing up. My sister and I were always playing pretend games where we were the princesses that were taken by the evil queen, and we had to like escape, you know, and save ourselves and all this stuff. And so it was always very adventurous. And we grew up in rural Colorado, which is lots of rolling hills and scrub oak and just places to play and let your imagination run. And so a lot of my reading tends to reflect that, of these adventures and, you know, either damsels, not always like damsels in distress being rescued by princes. They were usually damsels who were like, I'm going to figure this out for myself. You know? Yeah. And I, you know, when I went through college, I didn't read all that much of what I normally do, just because I was so weighted down with all of the like anthropology and then into communication. It was a lot of what we were required to read. And so I didn't get to read as much. And even since I've graduated, I get through maybe a couple, 2 or 3 books a year. But I always gravitate back to that stuff. It's just, I don't know. It just lends more to the imagination. I guess I like the escapism of it, but I also, I like that there are still very much real world applications, and you still feel the strength and the empathy and the emotions that the characters go through, going through trials that, you know, you normally never would. And it's like, real life is real life. And I experience that every day. So I'd rather read something that takes me to another place that probably will never exist. So
I'm currently in email negotiations back and forth with a future guest, and we've been going for 6 weeks.
Oh, wow.
Trying to decide what book she's going to choose.
Yeah.
And, you know, every email says the same thing. It's really not up to me. It's up to you. Honestly, anything you want to talk about. And you were the exact opposite experience. As soon as in the conference that we were at together, as soon as I said I would like to talk to you about your favorite book, you immediately came at me and said, this is the book I would love to talk to you about. There was absolutely no dancing at all. You had no qualms deciding right away this was your book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's always been my favorite book. I've had others that like come close. One of my other top picks would have been Sabriel by Garth Nix. And it's just a great fantasy, kind of like dark fantasy, but I love the magic in it. I love the world and I love that book. But and then the Hyperion series is really excellent too. I recommend that. I think that should be the next big HBO series that they take on, to be honest. You know, I know Dune is coming out, and Dune is like such a classic favorite, but Hyperion, man, there's just nothing that compares, I think. But Biting the Sun. Dune? Yes, I have. Yep.
But you think Hyperion's better?
I don't know if it's better, but I think because it's a 4-part series and then it ends after that, I think everything gets wrapped up very neatly. Whereas a series like Dune, I think could maybe get dragged out a bit. Like I never made it through the second book, to be honest. I felt like the first book should have stood alone and then been done with it. But yeah, Biting the Sun was always my favorite. And I was trying to think about when I found it or even how, and I am struggling to even remember. I think I must have seen the cover at a bookstore. I loved going to the bookstore and just looking, like literally judging a book by its cover and seeing what was the prettiest or the coolest font or whatever. And I must have picked that one up. And I think I found it when I was in elementary school, I think. So I read it pretty young, and I didn't finish it the first time that I read it. Yeah, it's a challenging book to get through at that age.
I would think so.
The language and the imagery, and I still go back and refer to the glossary with all the slang. I'm still like, how long is a rural? How long is a wreck? I don't remember.
Right.
But yeah, I loved the imagery, and I loved how how much this character felt like she didn't ever truly fit in. Like she did, but she also always felt a bit of a freak or an outsider, always felt a bit queer. And that resonated with me. I don't think I truly understood why until I read it the second time, right after I graduated college, when I was in a very different place in my life, had much different experiences, and just added a whole new layer to it. And now, several years out of grad school and college, there's more layers to who I am and how I see this book now. So,
can you tell our listeners a brief outline of the story of this book?
Biting the Sun is about this planet that is set in the future of its time. And there's 3 cities, 4 Bu, 4 Bi, 4 Ba. They're like dome cities. So they're self-contained cities. And all of the humans in this city are essentially taken care of. All of their every need that they could imagine is taken care of by androids and robots. And the humans are left to experience whatever they could possibly desire. It's a completely hedonistic society, essentially. Every pleasure you could imagine. You can kill yourself over and over and enter a new body because they found a way to preserve the life spark that makes humans what they are and transfer that into new bodies. And so you can be any gender that you want. You can have 4 arms and 3 eyes if you like. And there's 2 classes of humans. There's the Jang, which is the sort of young, what you might consider the millennials currently. They're the young class. And then you've got the older people, and they've sort of graduated beyond that class, and they're the more serious and, they're not as wild and carefree. And it's interesting because the Jang are very much expected to have this they call it essential experience, capital E, essential experiences, like going to these different places that kind of alter your senses, and, being able to have love with all these different people. And what I think is really odd in this book too is that you have to marry another person in order to have sex with them. But you can get married for the afternoon, but you have to get having sex out of wedlock is just a big taboo for them. Mm-hmm. And it's very strange and interesting. I would have loved to talk to Tanith Lee about why she chose that. I should describe the main character. Is you're experiencing the story from her perspective, and you never know her name, which is kind of common theme for Tanith Lee. But you never know her name, and she starts to feel very uneasy in her life. She starts to feel as though there's something missing, and she doesn't know what it is. And she just goes on this sort of manic spree to try and figure out how to fill this void or whatever she's feeling. And it takes her on some pretty unexpected turns.
It's so interesting to me that you used the word, when you were first describing it, that she felt queer in her setting, because given that there's so much gender fluidity and there's so much sexual fluidity, it's literally their defining quality. That's intriguing to me that you use the word queer to describe to describe it in terms of feeling out of place, the way this character did.
Yeah, and they do actually use that word queer at one point. She describes her and this other character, Danor, I think, who the 2 of them always felt a bit queer. And that wasn't necessarily a word in my vocabulary to describe myself until pretty recently. And I've been coming out as a queer woman slowly over the past year-ish to family and friends. And for a while I thought, okay, I'm probably bisexual. Like, I'm definitely not straight. But the more that I've spent time alone exploring what that means and exploring what I identify as, the more that word seems to fit for me. And reading this book again just confirms that all over again, that I always felt not only that I wasn't straight, but that I also was sort of on the fringes of a lot of things. I never had one group of friends. I would sort of float in between friend groups, and I would sort of float between activities. I would try all kinds of stuff, but it wouldn't always stick. And that's how, interesting enough, that's how communication is in the social sciences, is that communication is the fringe. It is the thread that weaves all of the social sciences together. And that's how I feel. I feel like I'm just sort of this thread that weaves a lot of different things together. And so, this book challenges a lot of ideas about what I think the time that it was written probably would have been really interesting to read when it was first published, because I think the idea of changing bodies, gender swapping, but still being predominantly one thing or another, and then having love with all these different people, and how being one gender changes her mindset versus being another gender, how certain characters in the book, when they're male, they're more docile, and when they're female, they're more aggressive, or vice versa. The one thing I will say is that if she had written this in present day, I think there wouldn't be as much heterosexual connection, because it seems like even though you can swap bodies, they only ever seem to marry the opposite gender or the opposite sex. And I think that's interesting. So I think maybe if she'd written it now, she may have bent that a little bit more, and not, there would have been even more fluidity between all of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, at the end, when they're sort of living in their new Eden, which is exactly, I couldn't stop myself from thinking of it that way, with the garden and everything.
Yeah.
I believe 2 women wound up together, I think. But you're right. There was very little otherwise, wasn't there? It was mostly heterosexual relationships, even though they were all bouncing all over the place.
Yeah, I remember.
Bodies.
Yeah, I remember her saying next time I'm male, I'm definitely going to have sex with her. And it's like, you could now if you wanted.
Right.
But yeah, that's just, again, seeing the book differently now that I'm mostly out as a queer woman. It's interesting.
So then did you come back to it as an adult with better knowledge of yourself, or a more mature knowledge of yourself, and then look at it and go, oh, now I get why this meant something to me, or why this appealed to me in the first place?
I think the first time I read it, I was just so intrigued by the world, but also her sense of displacement in it, and feeling frustrated and feeling like there wasn't enough. Even though she had everything in her power, everything was given to her by this world, it still wasn't quite right. And I was talking to a friend the other day. I don't even know what we were talking about, but the idea that yes, sometimes we wish that all of our needs would be cared for, and that we would never have to want for anything. And that's sort of this ultimate paradise that that a lot of people perceive. But at the same time, if you're never challenged to grow or to struggle for anything, then you never grow. And I think that this character was seeking to grow and to really understand the meaning of life, because otherwise it's all pointless. You're not exploring and experiencing, you're not going through ups and downs and having to troubleshoot and work through things. She's frustrated looking for work, and here are these people sitting there pushing buttons, and she's like, oh, so if they don't push buttons, the whole thing goes to hell. And the bots are like, well, no, I mean, of course there's an automatic switch that goes off, so they don't really have to be here. We just give them something to occupy their time with. And she's like, God. And I think that as a kid, I felt a little bit unsatisfied with the mundane reality of life. And my family always described me as being a bit of a waif in life. I just never quite fit in wherever I went. I was a bit wispy and sort of airy and never fully present. But then after I read it, when I graduated college, that was a little bit different, because I definitely felt sort of manic at that time, because I was like unemployed right after college, and I was kind of living this carefree life, but I was trying to find work too. I'd also had some drug experiences that sort of related to the drug experiences in the book. And so that was like, oh, wow, now I can like kind of understand a little bit of that realm. And like, there's this whole new layer to like the visuals and the sort of 10th dimensional stuff that they go through. Not fully, but like, you know, and then, yeah, reading it now, again, it just reaffirms and all the things that I felt as a kid, and even colors that to be like, okay, I was always queer. I was always this like queer little girl, and now I am, and now I'm in a place where I feel like I can embrace that, because I think after a while I definitely exiled that part of myself a bit. Which is interesting, because her exile was actually a very freeing and liberating experience for her. Whereas for me, I had to sort of exile that part within myself in order to survive and be protected, because me and the world weren't really ready for that part to be welcome. And I didn't know how to express it. I didn't know how to talk about it, you know, and just growing up, there wasn't as much queer acceptance at that time. I think it's definitely got a lot better getting there. So,
I mean, it must be. You're saying it out loud on a podcast to a person you've never met before. So
yeah, right.
You obviously have a great deal of comfort with saying your words, you know, using the descriptive confidently.
Yeah, it's, you know, a lot of therapy, a lot of
God bless therapy.
Yeah, a lot of support from friends and family. So, yeah.
Well, I really liked that dimension of, I mean, that was the theme of the book, was that I kept thinking about how that even in this society where everyone is given everything, and, you know, all the things that teenagers normally get pissed off about, they all have all of it in this. They, you know, she steals whatever she wants. She just, there's no such thing as punishment.
Yeah.
There's no such thing as consequence. There's sort of pretend ideas, but she basically just steals things. And she still feels out of place, and she still feels awkward. And I just really like that. And I was thinking, what a good book this would be to just get in the hands of every teenager, you know, who that's just sort of the default of what's my place in this world. And it is almost an instructive book, I think, in that you could give it to them and say, even if you had everything you ever wanted, you're still going to feel out of place until you do the interior work and figure out who you are and who you want to be in this world, and find your own desert garden.
Yeah,
to stretch
exactly.
that metaphor.
Yeah, to build your own world. You know, I read an article that talked about how fort building when you're a kid is super, super important for them in their development and in their ability to learn how to create space for themselves in the world. And it's also, you know, great for like engineering and being creative and using different resources to build this little space for yourself, especially if you're working with your friends or your siblings, you know, to have that coordination of like that tribal mentality of like, let's set up the space for ourselves and we have to maintain it. And here's the entry and the outro point and the you know, how are we going to use this space? and that a lot of that tends to fade right around like 12 years old, when you're about to hit puberty, and you start to your brain shifts, and you start to see yourself in relation to the rest of the world, and you start looking at yourself in the mirror more. And girls might be, their bodies are changing, boys' bodies are changing, you're maybe wearing more makeup, but it's that focus on like your external self, rather than like how do we like navigate the world around us, but not necessarily like looking at ourselves and how other people see us. It's not about that. And I think I wish that fort building was a thing that we all did later on, because I love building forts. Like, it's so fun, and being able to create your own space. And I think in a sense, when you get older, when you're able to like, rent your own place or buy a house, that is that like next level of like, well, now I truly get to be the manifestation of my own space in the world. And I get to decorate or paint however I want. Fortunately, my parents were always encouraging of us being able to create our own space. Clearly, as I have this like massive wall mural behind me with forests, and we always got to paint our rooms whatever colors we wanted. But yeah, the character in the end, she truly gets to create her own space at the end of the book, and I love that she creates her own paradise garden, which is so. Yeah, it's so magical.
It was so magical. And I wish I could see some sort of representation of the animals that she came across too.
Oh, yeah.
That was a fun description. Even the snake. She kept talking about a snake, but then the swan went to go live with the snake, and the swan kept sneezing the snake's fur or something. I was like, what the hell is happening with this snake? So they're furry snakes or something. I don't know. But
yeah, there were a few different snakes in the book for sure. There was some like pearl encrusted snakes, and
right.
Yeah, I know. I love the pet that like she has this thing where she like makes you fall in love with some characters, and then about halfway through she wrecks it. And she did that, and I cry. I still cry every single time. I'm like, God damn, why'd you have to kill the pet? It's so sad. Yeah, she has a habit of doing that to her readers. It's interesting because I think it was originally published as 2 books. The first one was Don't Bite the Sun, and the second one was Drinking Sapphire Wine. And I don't know why they decided to combine them into one, but I like that they did, but I can see what you mean, because reading it for the third time, I'm now starting to see those little clues. They're so subtle, like little things here and there about the QRs and the androids and the life spark and, their jealousy of humanity. And just like those small little things that are very hinted at. And, to be honest, I'm not totally satisfied with the ending. And I think part of it is like, I never want this world to end because I just love being in it. I love enveloping myself into that world. But it just felt a little bit too easy, a little bit too anticlimactic. And I felt like she could have gone a little bit more into the stakes of this conflict between the androids and the humans, because she did that so subtly. But it is cool to like go back and see it a little bit here and there, just get like little droplets throughout that kind of hint at what might be to come. So like for the most part, you think it's this internal struggle, but towards the end, it's really this, it's a little bit bigger than that. And I did also notice that there's a switch between the first part and the second part. The first part, I feel like you really get that like sense of manicness in her brain, that like neuroses that she constantly has just in like her describing things and her activities. And she's constantly on ecstasy, and she's like, flitting from one thing to the next, and just, you feel that. And then in the second part, even before she gets exiled, there's just like this neutrality that comes over her as she's like spending more and more time in the history tower and learning about this old world. And and then when she goes out into the desert, it's not quite as jumpy. It feels a little bit more fluid, like she's calm and she's away from the craziness.
And that's after the loss of the pet, right?
Yeah. She's like really confronted for the first time and kind of uniquely out of all of her friends with the idea of impermanence. Because everything else, you didn't think about it. The one thing that I wanted to kind of talk about too, and we don't have to go super in depth with it, but I love it as a sci-fi concept, is the fact that their world is run off of their emotions. Their like physical manifestation of energy from their emotions is what fuels everything that is possible. And the androids, they feed off of it, and maybe even a little bit greedily, but at the same time, like that's the only way that they can provide what they can for the humans, because they're there to serve humanity. Which I think is so fascinating.
Which is what a payment is, right? Every time they said she has to pay for a marriage or pay for an annulment, she had to go in and pay, and she would say, but I didn't care. I just went in and paid. And I thought, wait, I thought there was no money. And it took me a while to figure out. So that's what a payment was. They paid in emotion.
Yeah, that's why they have like all the, she looks over and someone's getting frenzied and working themselves up into a frantic, and they're taking ecstasy pills to like really help them along, and she's just like screaming thank yous and thank you. Right. How groshing, all this stuff. And like, that's the currency, is their emotions.
And then yet the entire rest of their existence is numbing all other emotion with the pills and with the random sex and with the dreams that they create themselves. You must have loved that part, the way they could construct them like a construction site.
Yes.
That was fascinating.
If only we had those. I would love that. I would probably never wake up. I'd always just stay in the dream world.
Yeah, that was that's fever dream. I'm telling you, I thought that the whole time. The whole thing was a big, long fever dream. Have you read a lot of her books?
I've read quite a few, but honestly, it's not really saying much considering how many there are. I actually started her first book, BirthGrave, earlier this summer. Got about halfway through. She killed half the people that I was like starting to enjoy. And I was like, okay, well, I'm depressed. The character was depressed. I'm like, I don't think I can finish this right now. So I've just like put it on the shelf with the bookmark sticking out, sadly.
Okay. But it'll be just like this one. You'll come back to it in 10 years and it'll be a transformative book.
That one's a trilogy actually, but that was her first truly published book. And, I just started the Flat Earth series. There's like several books in that. I think there's like 4 or 5. And I read Knight's Master, which was really good because it's a very folklore mythology. And I love reading mythology. And it's completely fictional. I mean, she wrote it all, but it reads like mythology. And it's just so awesome. Like so dark. And she has a very like dark fantasy, sci-fi, erotica style that I think publishers started to find a hard time finding a niche for her to publish stuff in, which is so unfortunate because I think there's totally a place for it and an audience. And then she wrote another book called White as Snow, which is a retelling of Snow White, which is, it's very adult. The main character, I don't remember her name, who is Snow White essentially, was a princess, and she ends up getting like raped by her father or her stepfather or something. And then she runs away into the forest in the mountains, and she finds this dog who gives birth to these other dogs. I think they were like greyhound puppies. And so those were like the 7 dwarfs, and they helped her get through like the winter and everything. And it's kind of her journey through dealing with that trauma and then kind of having her revenge on the trauma, which is really cool.
I love a fairy tale retelling.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. I just love her writing style. I love her description. It's very poetic, and I don't know. Sometimes feels a little bit long-winded, but at the same time, I don't mind. Yeah.
So what are you reading these days?
Well, like I said, I started BirthGrave. And then I found another book called The Sisters of the Winter Wood. And that one you'd probably like it because it's a bit of a fairy tale retelling, but it's more of like an amalgam of different fairy tales that this woman had researched. And so it's set in like Eastern Europe, closer to Russia, in like the early 1900s. And it's this like Jewish community, and there are these two girls who are raised in the forest with their parents, and one of them, it's interesting. It's written in two different prose. So like the one sister is written from first person perspective as a narrative, and then the other sister writes from first person, but like in poetry. So it's really interesting. I'm not sure why she chose to do that, but yeah, it's kind of, there's a few different fairy tales. So there's the one that stands out the most that I think it was strongly based on was Snow White and Rose Red.
Okay.
Which is more of the like original story of Snow White before all the like evil stepmother was written into it. But it's about these two sisters, and they discover a prince who comes to the door in the form of a bear, and they find a goblin who is, they keep running into this. He's not a goblin. I think he's just a dwarf. They keep running into him basically, and they keep helping him, and he's not very grateful. And then they find a bird who is also a prince, and it turns out the dwarf turned the bear and the bird, turned those princes into the bear and the bird. Mm-hmm. And so the sisters help the princes become themselves again. So in this story, the sisters are the bear and the swan. And they realize that they're from these magical lineages of bears and swan clans. And meanwhile, there's some goblins in the forest, and there's some Jewish massacres happening. And so you get there's like a lot of Yiddish language going on in there, and there's a lot of trying to contend with like this real world threat to their culture and their way of life, as well as trying to deal with these like mystical fairy tale elements going on.
Oh my God, that sounds so good.
Yeah, it was really, really interesting. It was definitely a different book than I've read before, but
why are swans always in fantasy stories?
I know, right? There's a lot of lore and mythology around them. Yeah, same really with bears. I feel like bears are there, but yeah.
Huh. Well, Robyn, I want to thank you for introducing me to this book. I have to tell you, in a million years, I would not have picked this one up on my own. Yeah. This is my cover. Do you have this version of it?
Yeah, and I love looking at this cover so much. Like, I love trying to like see all the things. You've got the snakes, you got the little gray eye creatures in there, which I didn't finish it before the interview. Down there at the bottom, the little creatures.
Yeah.
That's how I imagine
those.
That's how I imagine either the gray eyes or the pet that she grabs.
Okay, yeah. I didn't even see that.
But yeah, there's just so much to look at there.
Well, in all honesty, I would have, if I'd have seen this at a bookstore, I would have passed up because I would have thought, oh, this is some weird religious allegory, or I'm not a big fantasy or sci-fi reader anyway, so I wouldn't have even looked twice. And I'm so delighted that you introduced me to it and I got a chance to read it, and it was so fun, and I want to thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for reading it and for talking to me about it. It's not often that I get to talk about this particular book.
And now we'll get other people to read it. Why don't you tell our listeners where they can find you and all your wonderful projects?
Yeah, so Dreams Talk is on all of the podcatchers, Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts. And then the Playlist Challenge you can find at theplaylistchallenge.com. You can listen to the podcast separately on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, everywhere else.
Thank you, Robyn. It has been wonderful talking to you.
You too. Thanks.
Thanks for listening, bookworms. For more information on this episode and links to everything we discussed, please go to our website, bestbookeverpodcast.com, or follow us on Instagram at bestbookeverpodcast. I'm your host, Julie Strauss, and you can find me everywhere as Julie Wrote a Book. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a review on whatever podcatcher you use. Reviews really help our visibility to new listeners, and we are so grateful for everyone. If you want access to exclusive content, including extra interview time with our guests, advance notice of the books we're going to discuss, monthly curated book selections, and more, go to patreon.com/bestbookever. That's patreon.com/bestbookever to support us. Your financial support really helps with the expenses of running this podcast. Thanks for joining me today, and I will see you at the library.